Welcome back to the European Parliament for the second part of Talking Europe. My guest today is Pascal Lamy, the Director General of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, a position he has held since 2005. A keen marathon runner, Mr. Lamy is described as tenacious and obstinate, two qualities he has used to try and champion the cause of free trade and multilateralism. He will tell us why. Mr. Lamy, thank you for joining us here on France 24 in the European Parliament in Brussels. Now, your organisation, the WTO, cut its forecast for growth in global trade from 3.7 to 2.5%. Is Europe to be blamed for this very disappointing result?
Yes, we've had to cut down our forecast at a very low level compared to previous years, and this slower growth of world trade in volume than expected has to do with growth slowing down everywhere, especially on big export markets, and Europe is clearly the first in line, because if you look at US, Europe, Japan, where this slowdown is the most obvious is Europe. Now, in many ways, international trade is a transmission belt between demand and supply. Demand shrinks, supply shrinks, trade shrinks. So there is a European factor in this result. Because of slow growth in Europe, it's not the only one. We know that the US economy is growing less than the medium-term term. We know that they also have to face this fiscal cliff sometime starting end of this year. And as you know, Japan is not doing extremely well either. So that's the main reason.
You warned that the crisis could be longer than some had thought initially. Is it to say that you are pessimistic for next year as well?
I'd say I'm cautiously pessimistic. I think this global crisis, and it's a global one, I mean, no country on this planet for the first time in history has been, nor will be, immune of this crisis. I think we are not yet out of the woods, and in the case of Europe, it probably will take minimum 5 years before European growth, if proper policy measures are put in place to pick up to the sort of normal historical trend.
Now, when you look at the situation in Europe, is it the case that the general austerity policies that have been implemented across the Eurozone have actually killed any hope of reviving growth?
The starting point is well known. European economies, on average, had accumulated too much debt, like, by the way, the US economy. Part of that comes from before the crisis, part of that comes from the policies which they've put in place to fight against the shock of the crisis. So this has to be done. I don't think there's any question that this needs to be done. The question is, while you have to do this, which certainly has a growth slowing impact, but which is necessary for future generations to be able to grow, what can you do in order to stimulate growth? Now, we know what Europe has to do to stimulate growth. It has to increase its growth potential in becoming a more efficient European economy, for instance, in extending the scope of the internal market. There are areas like services, for instance, where if you compare the European economy and the US economy, the European economy is missing growth because of insufficient economic integration.
And are you seeing real signs that EU leaders are determined to revive growth?
Let's say, I think that's coming. If I compare the perception by the rest of the world of the capacity of Europeans to exit from this crisis, I think the jury now would be in a much better mood than it was, let's say, 6 months or a year ago. So the signs are that they are starting to find their way out. Not that 100% of the jury outside Europe is convinced, but I think is taking place. And what Europe needs for this credibility of this exit strategy is more stability, less open disagreement, more convergence under the direction of European institutions, starting with the central bank, and I think that's what Mario Draghi is doing. I would sometimes wish that other European institutions also come in order to convince the rest of the world that the policy direction is right, which, by the way, might also have some impact within Europe, where these things, unfortunately, remain very obscure for many European citizens.
Very obscure for many European citizens, I guess that's what they think, indeed. Now, this program is co-produced with the Robert Schuman Foundation, a leading think tank on European affairs. Its Director General, Pascal Joannin, had a question for you. Let's listen to her.
Dear Mr. Lamy, you just announced a slowing in the world trade growth in 2012 and 2013. With the crisis, the EU internal trade decreased in the second quarter by 12%, and there is evidence of a return of protectionism. Rhetoric protectionism is growing, notably in France. What do you say to those to try to challenge free trade? Should the EU continue to negotiate free trade agreement, as it has just done with Korea, Peru and Colombia, and as it plans to discuss with China, Japan and the USA?
Now, you heard the question, has the economic crisis sparked protectionist reactions across Europe? Is that what you're seeing on a daily basis?
No, what we're seeing in WTO, and we have a radar screen that permanently tracks trade restrictive measures worldwide, is a bit of slippage here and there. Not so far in Europe. So, under the list of my usual suspects, Europe is not top of the list for the moment. Now, there are protectionist pressures, but I think the majority of European governments, the majority in the Council of Ministers, the majority in the European Parliament is not a protectionist majority.
But you have strong voices even within the French government who are saying there is a problem. We have signed bilateral free trade agreements. I'm thinking, for instance, between the EU and South Korea. France is being flooded with cheap Korean cars. This is a problem. This is unfair. Now, you are in favor of free trade, of fair trade, but do you understand those voices?
No, I understand this notion that many people who don't quite get it what the international economy is about, who don't really understand that in today's world 40% of what you export is imports. I do understand that this old mercantilist mantra that imports are bad and exports are good is still there. This does not match with today's world of trade. In today's world of trade, exports are good and imports are good. Now, I heard and I can hear some voices here and there, including in France, that have been going in the direction. The European trade policy is decided by majority in the European Council. And my own guess is that there is not and will not be a majority in the Council or in the Parliament to switch to a trade policy which would be protectionist.
Now, talking about free trade, the European Union and the US are set to launch new free trade talks in order to improve their relationship, their trading relationship. Is a new bilateral agreement between Brussels and Washington needed?
Depends on what will be in there. There's no a priori judgment that doing this is good or bad. There are bilateral agreements. Some of these bilateral agreements are stepping stones to further multilateral agreements. Some of them may look like stumbling blocks to further multilateral agreements. It all depends on what's in the bag. And we all know that starting trade talks is one thing, concluding trade talks is another thing.
Because what you would like to see, of course, is a sort of global agreement that would have been embodied by the Doha round of talks. But this is deadlocked at the moment. We know the reasons. The US, India don't want to change the system of farming subsidies. Now, this is one of the problems. There are, of course, many other problems. Is this Doha round of talks dead and buried?
No, it's deadlocked, not dead. And by the way, where the talks got stalled is not on agriculture between US and India. Where the talks got stuck is between US and China on industrial tariffs. So for the moment, the big deal is not available. What WTO members are trying to do is to see whether they can reap low-hanging fruit, which have progressed during these 10 years. And one of the areas which has a major importance, especially for small businesses, which is trade facilitation. And by this we mean streamlining, simplification of border crossing administrative procedure. This part of the Doha deal may be looking for convergence, maybe sometime next year, and that would be an important trade opening agreement.
Now, it's the latest development in the ongoing dispute between Airbus and Boeing. The European Commission has lodged a complaint with the WTO because they say the US continues to subsidize, illegally they say, Boeing. Is there a problem there?
Not for me to say. In these disputes, the WTO DG has to remain neutral. I cannot be seen as putting the rag in one direction or another. This is for the WTO dispute settlement, for the WTO judge to decide, not for me.
Last week, Angela Merkel blocked a possible merge between Airbus and EADS, that's to say, and British Aerospace. Is this a sort of protectionism on behalf of Germany to try and block?
I mean, I wasn't, and that's perfectly natural, associated with these talks from anywhere near. So I know Germany played a big role in blocking this agreement. I haven't discussed this with Angela Merkel at all. We will have a meeting very soon. Whether we will discuss that or not is for her to decide. So I don't read enough of what led to this German opposition. What I believe as an expert is that given that defense budget will be shrinking in the years to come, which means a shrinking market, it probably makes sense to merge and put together BAE on the one side, EADS on the other one. Although I can understand that in the part of the deal which has to do with weapons, and BAE is a lot about weapons, there may be a German constitutional problem which may need to be considered.
You mentioned China earlier. There is a growing sense of fear in Europe, but also in the US. Just look at the debate between Obama and Romney. China is on the table all the time. There's this fear of not being able to handle this new superpower. What can you do to make sure that there is some sort of reciprocity between China and its partners? Because you want free trade, but what the French are saying, what the Americans are saying, is that the Chinese aren't playing with the same rules.
Well, what I'm looking for is more open trade. The notion of free trade as such is misleading, as if trade would have to be free everywhere for everybody.
Let's call it open
whatever.
trade.
That's, I think, the right view. Now, China, in joining the WTO, subscribed disciplines which are WTO disciplines. And China is still, and you just have to go there to understand, a developing country. And the notion that China, with a GNP per head, which is much, much, much smaller than the European GNP per head or the American GNP per head, should play by the same rules is something that, for the moment, does not match with the principles of WTO. in the WTO, we traditionally have had a lot of reciprocity between economies of the same level of development and more flexibilities for trade between developing countries or between developed and developing countries. Now, the case of China, obviously, is somewhere in between. And China does not pretend it should have the same rules as Laos, PDR, or Senegal. Mm-hmm. But China probably would not accept if the Chinese leaders were discussing with you, and they are members of WTO, that the rule should be China-US level playing field. That, I'm sure, they do not accept. There may be a vision that there will have to be a level playing field in the future, but I think what China will say is we are not the US, we are still a much smaller economy and a much poorer economy. We still have huge development problems.
Pascal Lamy, but the world is changing very fast, as you know, as we know. Now, your term will end in August next year. The emerging economies are saying it's now our turn to have someone at the helm of the WTO. Do you welcome this idea?
I mean, the WTO selection process is not done on a geographical basis. My predecessor came from a developing country that is Thailand. So it's not something that is about rotation between developed and developing. It's more of a headhunting exercise than a diplomatic exercise.
Pascal Lamy, Director General of the WTO, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And thank you for watching this edition of Talking Europe from the European Parliament in Brussels. Let's now cross over to Paris for more news.